Okay, next it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jerry McMahon. Jerry did all of his academic work in the economics and environmental planning sides of the world. He has a PhD, of course, and he's currently and recently selected as the director of the new DOI Southeast Climate Science Center, which is located at NC State in Raleigh, North Carolina. I don't know Dr. McMahon at all. We got to meet this morning, but as you'll read in the biography that's been provided, he's apparently spent a lot of his time working first at USGS and then in stream ecosystems, and I'm sure he's going to have some illuminating things to share about climate change and fish and wildlife resources in this part of the world. Welcome.
Thanks, Ron, and good morning. I have to acknowledge that actually Virginia was the person originally considered for this USGS slot, and I'm ending up talking about what colleagues at USGS are doing related to SEARAP. And I came into this morning feeling, well, this is really cool. We were asked to talk about SEARAP, but now I understand after Bill's talk why maybe I'm here and not Virginia's here. But to kind of get back a little bit, maybe instead of the angel of death, I'll offer a lot of sort of obscure, arcane science stuff. So we'll get you guys one way or the other. So what I want to do today actually is spend about half of my time looking at a context for thinking about SEARAP and conservation, cooperative conservation in an area of disruptive change. And I don't know that I'll quite get to the point of presenting some vision statements as Bill did on the science side, but I do want to look at some conceptual framework issues and some of the things to think about as we move forward doing the science in this area. And then after that, I'll run through a quick overview of the SEARAP activities. And I do want to let people know that actually we have an extended session this afternoon on a lot of the individual projects that I'll necessarily have to quickly run through in my talk this morning. So I'd encourage folks to join us this afternoon. So in terms of the context stuff, what are we talking about when we think about connecting climate change and resource management? A little bit about this new DOI Climate Science Center in the Southeast, and then a couple of challenges that strike me on the science side for connecting science and management. This slide lays out a set of activities that need to occur, I think, as we move from broad conclusions about global climate system to effective management strategies. So, of course, global climate models provide the overarching context for understanding changing climate, but they're really too coarse for management use. And so we develop downscaled information from regional climate models that provide us with finer scale temporal and spatial information. And climate characteristics such as precip and temp interact with other biophysical factors, of course, to shape the terrestrial and aquatic landscape. And these changes, in turn, can serve as stressors for biota. And so understanding the exposure, the sensitivity, the resilience of biota to such stressors let scientists take a crack at forecasting the impacts of climate on landscape and on biota. And assessing the vulnerability and designing adaptive management strategies occurs really at the intersection of the scientific disciplines that a lot of us are familiar with and social science disciplines. And really, these are all necessary to look at what, in fact, is a coupled human environmental system. And again, it's unavoidable. We may not all be comfortable with the social science side, but I think it's really unavoidable if we're going to meet the requirements and the desires that society has in terms of resource management to look at the interaction of the social and the physical sciences. So as a second part of this context, we have Secretary Salazar's initiative related to the creation of these climate science centers and the landscape conservation cooperatives, with the climate science centers focusing generally on combining climate information from these global and regional models with ecological understanding to produce better forecast of ecosystem response. And the LCC is working at devising science-based conservation strategies, applying those strategies in specific places, and evaluating their effectiveness using monitoring. So revisiting the diagram from a slide or so ago, the Southeast CSC is based at NC State. That's our host institution. And the 7 LCCs, whose areas intersect with the boundaries of the Climate Science Center, are our primary clients, essentially, is the way to think about it. And generally speaking, the tasks associated with looking at these climate change disruptions are allocated between the CSCs and the LCCs in the following way, as best we all understand at this point. At the front end, the LCCs basically are defining the science information agenda. CSC staff, NC State staff, other USGS scientists, other science colleagues are basically focused on meeting those science information needs, which are likely to include, again, characterizing these climate-related processes, characterizing biophysical outcomes, linking those to ecosystem response, and then at least starting to consider what are some adaptive management strategies that we can use to get things maybe in a better place than they could be heading right now. And at the back end, the LCCs then really are the ones that are carrying the water in terms of taking that science information and using it to shape adaptive management strategies. And I will say that although there's not a specific monitoring component that's part of the CSC effort, monitoring is going to need to occur, and that's going to be a partner-based collaborative effort, hopefully involving USGS, but probably as much as anything involving states and NGOs and universities perhaps as well. And I want to close this slide noting the generous use of the word generally that I used. In fact, from CSC to CSC, those tasks and responsibilities may be allocated slightly different in different places depending on staff expertise and budgets and so forth. But generally speaking, CSCs are going to be doing science-related stuff. LCCs will be doing science as well, but they're the ones that are really focused on the adaptive management stuff. Status of the CSC, we got going about a year ago. Sonia Jones and I have sort of split the tasks of serving as director, with myself starting as the director formally in July. We have a draft science plan, although it was interesting being involved in the conversations yesterday. I already am seeing there are ways that science plan needs to evolve to reflect some needs and interests that I heard about yesterday. We have a co-op agreement with NC State, so this year we're funding 12 graduate students and a couple of postdocs, and that's likely to continue and perhaps expand in the coming years. So the research priorities, I've actually rephrased what we have in the science plan a little bit different way, because I think it actually reflects the way that science is done, I guess, if you will. The first priority really has to do with characterizing a couple of key global change processes that are associated with this coupled human-environmental system. Global change processes, of course, being processes that really affect the capacity of the Earth to sustain life. And the two global change processes that we're really focusing on right now have to do with climate information, and particularly downscaling from global climate models to regional models, but also land use change, in particular the phenomenon of urban land use change. So those are our two global change processes that we're focusing on. Now those global change processes, of course, have a biophysical outcome, and the kinds of biophysical outcomes that we're going to be looking at include vegetation and stream change dynamics, stream flow, stream temperature, sea level rise. Now, global change has these biophysical outcomes. They serve as stressors, and another part of what USGS Global, the Climate Science Center, is going to be doing is linking those biophysical outcomes with ecosystem response for at least some focal taxa. And so we're looking right now, and SEAFWA in particular is looking at fish and mussels and birds. And finally, we have a research priority, and this fourth one is the one that's actually not in the science plan right now, but I think it's inescapable that we need to be considering explicitly as part of our work how we support vulnerability assessment and also adaptive management activities. We see ourselves as one participant in the conversation, but I think that we have an important role to play in that conversation. So the last part of the context is really three different considerations, and this gets more into the visionary of how the science is done, but three different considerations in connecting climate change and resource management. One dealing with just the nature of these coupled human environmental systems, and then two others that are dealing generally with this question of who cares and so what. So the evolution of a landscape from these conditions to these conditions really involves a complex set of biophysical processes that are operating at a lot of different scales. At the broad scale, you can think of climate change, you can think of biogeography-related things. At an intermediate scale, you have human activities, such as building national and state road systems, and at a very local scale, you have runoff from impervious surfaces. So together, all these kinds of processes can be thought of as defining a coupled human environmental system. Get all these things up. So this conceptual diagram, which comes from the CRAP program, suggests, I think, at least four different important facets of these coupled human environmental systems. First of all, they're complex, dynamic. They involve interactions among a lot of compartments at a lot of scales, and they include humans. Second, uncertainty in the representation of the processes and interactions is unavoidable. And this is really important to recognize when models are used to support assessments of vulnerability and potential conservation strategies. If we don't account for that uncertainty, we're going to be missing some important information. Third, and this really relates to that point estimates of predicted system outcomes hide the range of outcomes that exist in reality. And some of these potential outcomes might have significantly different impacts on society. So a failure to consider the full range of potential outcomes could result in the implementation of conservation strategies that are suboptimal in terms of the overall value to society. Now, I gotta say, this slide is killing me. I can't give up the content on one hand, but I have just never figured out a good way to present it in PowerPoint. And I'm hoping, actually, we're here in Nashville, that there's probably some songwriter out there that can write me a song about that dilemma. But at any rate, work with me as I sort of go through these compartments, starting on the lower left. I think that one of the challenges in putting all this stuff together is coming up with a mental picture of all the different things that are in play out there and how these things relate to each other. So this slide, which is adapted from some work by Billy Turner up at Clark University and also from the USGS Geography Science Plan, I think takes a cut at doing that and has some useful characteristics, even though it stinks for PowerPoint. So in box one in the lower left represent these global change processes I mentioned before, which include humans. And that's really important throughout this diagram to realize that humans are part of the biota out there that are involved in these processes. So those processes in box one have biophysical outcomes that are shown in box two. can be land cover related, land use related, sea level rise. And again, humans are part of these biophysical outcomes of these global change processes. Well, those outcomes can act as stressors for biota, and you can have outcomes that reflect sudden changes, but you can also have these continuous or slowly progressing changes. And all those things can create an impact on biota, and box 4 talks about those responses in terms of vulnerability and resilience. So the left-hand part of box 4, we look at exposure issues. In the middle, we look at sensitivity issues, and on the right side, we look at resilience issues. So with the information in box 4, we can step down to box 5 into the management arena and see if what's there is what we want to be there, and if not, what can we do to affect things back in box 1 and 2 and so forth. A key part of that previous diagram involves that box 4, I think it was, that looked at vulnerability assessment, kind of exposure, sensitivity, and resilience, in terms of all that stuff tying together into some measure of outcome or endpoint. To me, well, first of all, I think that those endpoints or those outcomes essentially represent an information baton, if you will, between the science side and the management side. And so, go back to this one for a second. Ideally, those information batons, if you will, or the endpoints shown up here in box 4, I think should have some characteristics. And let me read those off real quick. I think that they need to be tangible outcomes that can be measured in a consistent manner. I think they need to make ecological sense. I mean, in other words, they need to describe the results of one or more ecological processes that can be described in commonly understood terms, and essentially they can be modeled. A third characteristic of these endpoints, to me, seems that, and this gets to some things that both Ron and Bill talked about, these endpoints need to be connected with human well-being. Society needs to care about them, or else they might be of great interest to scientists and to the 25 people who will read the journal article that you publish, but it's really not going to go much further than that. And basically, these endpoints need to physically exist for those benefits to exist for society. So back to this slide, and I throw this up as an example, I think, of one approach that's been taken for the endpoint problem, and this is the biological condition gradient developed by EPA and the states for working with aquatic systems. And there's 6 different tiers for assessing, in this case, invertebrate samples from a stream. And basically the tiers, these outcomes, these 6 different outcomes, can be used to assess whether or not a stream is attaining. So the hook, from a science standpoint, scientists would say, yeah, basically this makes sense as a way to characterize streams. From a management or from a who cares standpoint, these endpoints matter a lot, because if you're in the top 3 or 4 categories, you're attaining. If you're in the bottom 2 categories, you're not attaining and you're facing a TMDL. So this is an example of the kinds of outputs that I think we as scientists need to be working with social scientists and managers to construct that make sense from a science standpoint, but be connected to on the who cares side. So that was theoretically the first half of the talk, and I'm already past that. So I'm going to move into the quick tempo of Johnny Cash, I've been everywhere mode, and quickly run through the SEAFWA project. And again, note that all these things that I'll be talking about in the next 10 minutes and more will be presented this afternoon. So this is a list of the team members. Again, there'll be someone from each of these teams speaking this afternoon. These are the basic questions addressed by CRAP. Essentially, what are the effects of climate changes that occur in box 1 all the way around to box 4, the ecosystem response. And then getting a little bit into this box 5, what can we do to avoid the worst effects of climate change? So in the global change end, as I said before, we're focusing on two different global change processes, the downscaling climate information and urban development projections. Basically, this representation of global change models, good information and actually scientifically pretty sound, is not of much use on the management side. So the downscaling effort is an attempt to use statistical processes to zoom in a bit from that global information to a scale that might be a bit more useful for managers. In terms of the land cover change, particularly focused on urban growth, we're using a model called Sleuth, and we've been doing that throughout the Southeast. The next step is to work both in the Appalachian LCC and the GCPO LCC. And so we, over the course of the next year, are moving through the Southeast to do this urban modeling. These global change processes have biophysical outcomes, some of which are listed here, and I'll quickly go through these. Sea level rise, of course, is a big biophysical outcome of interest in the Southeast, and so folks at our St. Pete office are using Bayesian approaches to look at estimating sea level rise. This is an example of that process where they're predicting shoreline change. That information can in turn be used in models to predict habitat loss due to sea level rise. And we have a sea level rise viewer. The URL is there, just using a bathtub model approach, essentially, and DEM models to look at what are the effects of different levels of sea level rise. Another area of research by Jen Costanza and colleagues at NC State is looking at vegetation dynamics. Those veg dynamics outputs, along with urban growth models, gap information, can be put into habitat availability models, which then can be used by Barry Grand and colleagues in looking at optimal conservation strategies. Another big area of effort involves using those regional climate predictions to figure out what's going to be going on with hydrology out there, actually with both stream flow and stream temperature. The precipitation runoff modeling system is the model that Jacob LaFontaine and colleagues are using. Really good model, but as is often the case with really good models, they're a challenge to calibrate and use. Very challenging to roll it out for a large spatial area. So I think one of the science conversations that's going to need to continue to go on in the Southeast is how can we get PRMS type information over a larger spatial area. So as I said before, outcomes are stream flow, stream temperature. This is an indication of some work that's going on in the ACF basin. So we have global change processes, we have biophysical outcomes, and then we have a response of biota. And as I said earlier, we've been focusing on birds and fish and mussels. Jaime Collazo at NC State and his colleagues have been working on the bird side, both the response of birds to just the physical change in temperature as well as to change in habitat. On the aquatic side, Mary Freeman and Jim Peterson have been looking at translating these biophysical outcomes into outcomes in fish and mussel species, and I want to emphasize that these are species-specific models and not community models. And again, with the idea of being able to predict future population status in terms of occupancy. Finally, and I think this is really one of the innovations of the CRAP project, and again, an area where I think the Climate Science Center really needs to rethink our commitment to this, is figuring out how to support vulnerability and assessment and adaptive management activities on behalf of societal goals. Well, that's an obvious one, but doing that is actually, I think, from a science standpoint, a really challenging activity, particularly to do that on a regional scale. And again, Barry and colleagues are working on that for CRAP. I think there's a series of talks about structured decision processes tomorrow. I think that while this is one of those mom and apple pie things that everyone agrees would be great to do, but I would say the science is not quite there yet to roll this out at a regional level in a way that, at least as scientists, we're completely comfortable with. But I think we're jumping in, we're getting a really good start, and you'll hear about some of this stuff tomorrow. And the next two slides sort of go through some of the steps involved in the effort that we're doing in CRAP in terms of this structured decision making. And ultimately, what you would like to get to is a GIS map that would flag the kinds of parcels that you need to be paying attention to in terms of meeting societal goals and values. So in closing, from a science standpoint, a lot of the stuff involved in kind of moving through those boxes from 1 to 5 is settled science. It's doable. There are interesting new questions. There are things from a research standpoint that are going to be interesting to work on. A lot of that stuff is pretty settled, especially going from box 1, 2, 3, and 4. But when you get into translating that science into this adaptive management mode, that's where I think from a science standpoint some significant research challenges are still out there, but challenges that are obviously well worth taking on for the kinds of reasons that Ron and Bill have mentioned in their talk. So in closing, I want to thank you all for letting us be part of that conversation that's going to help shape kind of what we want from the science and then give us direction in terms of the kinds of things we need to be doing at the Climate Science Center. Thanks.